This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So my work focuses on what the object can inform us about heterosexual love among English people in the 17th century. In doing this, I have faced challenges in formulating the innate qualities of the object into academic language, which I'm sure a lot of people here can empathise with. This can be frustrating, as the object is such a revealing and illuminating tool when trying to understand emotion. My intention in this paper is to discuss how I have extracted information from the object and to demonstrate through examples the critical relationship between the object and emotion. There are 5 principal methods for understanding this relationship between the object and love: through material, function, design, known provenance, and finally through quantitative analysis. This 5-prong method has been influenced by other scholars. However, I believe it does differ from other methodological approaches, which I believe tended to focus on the individual object. So that's taking a detailed description, allowing an emotional response, and generally abiding by a fairly rigid and therefore credible approach. Having now worked with the object for several years, I've come to 2 conclusions which have altered my own views on what is a credible method. The first pertains to how people feel and express emotion, and that's through a wide community of things. This much was noted by both Nigel Llewellyn and Roy Porter, who observed that grieving practices incorporate a great plethora of things. Taking grieving practices as an example, things have been divided into disciplines. So there are those who study art, who study ceramic, who study the word and literature and so forth. However, a great variety of pieces may all have been commissioned for the death of a loved one, and while understanding exactly why might be tricky, separating these sources into different categories of study is not a useful approach. These were all pieces of a grieving process, and it is the variety of sources which allows for a more compelling and fuller conclusion. My second overall conclusion is that a strict methodology for individual objects, as mentioned earlier, does not necessarily go hand in hand with the variety of source material. A variety of objects are currently housed by a variety of institutions, both public and private, and this complicates how we access them. So when I began this work, I had a strict method involving how to approach a source, a set of questions to ask of the object. However, I soon realised that this method was not flexible enough for objects which may be sealed behind glass, locked with a key that's been missing for 2 centuries, so fragile that opening, unfolding, holding or wearing is impossible, or there are those which I've come across that have been adapted and perhaps fixed to wooden panelling and so are now movable. Then there are also disputes surrounding objects. So date and place, ownership, creator, all of which could have large financial implications for those who claim to own or house the thing, and which may therefore affect my access. A rigid method of study does also not allow for the changing world of how we access sources. There are thousands of objects which are becoming digitised, which practically, in the time of a PhD thesis, I cannot hope to access in person. So while I began a committed hands-on researcher to using and wearing or holding each thing, I've come to realise that the digital world has much to offer too. Inscriptions can be read, materials catalogued, and known provenances all passed on via the web. For these reasons, my 5-pronged methodology came into being. The first 3 methods all concern the physicality of the object, so that's material, function, and design. There is, of course, room for overlap between these, but clarification of each is necessary for the purpose of this paper. So what do I mean by a method through material? So the reason why an object was created and the intentions behind it could affect the choice of material. Material, therefore, can reflect and infer the intentions of the maker or giver. For example, people wanted to use precious and valuable fabrics to create objects associated with betrothal and marriage, because marital love was considered precious and valuable. And here's an example of a gold wedding ring with a posy inside. So gold possessed a timeless and eternal quality, and this is why gold coins were also given at weddings. And while not everyone could afford a gold ring or coin, which do vary dramatically in value, there was a system of metals beneath gold, so silver, brass, copper and lead. This choice also reflected a desire to infer the value of marriage by acquiring the best fabric which the person could afford. Similarly, men and women bent coins to demonstrate their commitment to each other, and this is an example of over here. So while the act of bending the coin was clearly of significance, using a coin as the basis for that act is also important. It was an object with an innate value, legitimacy and repute, the perfect fabric to use as the basis for a promise. So an object of valuable, precious and long-lasting material unsurprisingly reflects the desired qualities of marital love. The other notable material for this topic is the use of hair, which is in objects to do with courtship, betrothal and mourning. And here's some examples. So people chose to incorporate hair within objects of mourning, and that's the two bottom ones there. I believe for two main reasons. The first was because hair doesn't break down as the rest of the body did, and it was one of the few parts of the body which could be taken easily and without invading the flesh. The breakdown of flesh was a particularly feared and unpleasant spectacle, or even just thought, for those grieving loved ones. The second reason is simpler. The hair of the loved one was a reminder of their presence. So hair offers this kind of wonderfully intimate and personal connection. And here, the material is key to understanding why pieces were created and what they were intended to convey. So the second of my 5-pronged methodology is to examine the function of an object. There are several surviving domestic utensils which reflects the giver's desire to provide a tool of necessity, of ease or of comfort to whom they are giving it to. In creating a gift or giving a person such a gift, we can identify caring intent. So, for example, there are several surviving apple corers from this period which are inscribed or decorated in a manner which suggests they were exchanged between lovers or given as marital gifts. So they were a tool to make the preparation of apples easier, but their function was also to help those with rotten teeth to eat one of the staple foods of the English diet. And that's going to be a lot of people, isn't it? The decoration of the piece reflects one aspect of love, and I'm going to move on to talk about design. But the corer reveals how these objects can infer sentiment through their function too. And there are other domestic tools which suggest similar intent. Some objects reveal the expectations and intentions of those who gave gifts to married couples, which provides another viewpoint of the expectations of married life. So, wedding chests, boxes and beds bring to light how friends and family were eager to present a couple with their own intimate spaces, often within busy households. In this instance, this is a spice box from colonial America, complete with the couple's initials, and a travelling marriage bed, complete with matching carvings of husband and wives, their names and wig boxes. They also give a clue as to how the inside of the domestic space was filled, and how material constructions of marriage were a prominent physical and visual part of the domestic space. My third approach is to examine the object through its design. This incorporates a wide range of qualities to analyse, so colour, pattern, inscription, motifs and other types of imagery. There are hundreds of surviving objects with this type of relevant pattern from the 17th century. So for example, the Fede symbol, which some may be familiar with, of two linked hands or hands reaching around a heart, was symbolic of a bond being made after marriage, as well as other figures such as Cupid or his bow and arrows, and as we've sort of already heard from today, true lovers' knots. These were all part of an early modern language and a culture of expressing love. Design is also of critical importance to the scholar, It is often only through design that a researcher can determine that an object did have an amorous intent. So here are two objects with designs very much concerned with portraying love. So on the bowl, colour-wise, we see the use of green for fertility, red for love and lust, black for death, which is what the groom is wearing, and white for purity. The bride and groom also join hands between hearts, and they are surrounded by rich and fertile fruits. This sort of imagery and those four colours are common on this type of object and appear within some literature too. To the left is a piece of cutlery called a lover's knife, and there are several surviving pieces of cutlery with carved handles that depict husband and wives. But this one is a little different. So on the front, we see a pair of lovers embracing, while on the reverse, which unfortunately don't have an image of, there is a small figure of a peeping or peeking Tom watching them. So this knife, or rather the ivory handle, the blade might be later, is a little different from the standard wedding utensil. There's an element of titillation and humour about it as well. The fourth point is analysis with the help of known provenance. This may be an object with a personal association. For example, Pilgrim Hall in Massachusetts houses several objects which belonged to early colonists. So the first object of interest here is the shoe, which is thought to have been worn by a colonist called Penelope Pelham when she married Josiah Winslow on a visit to London in 1651. The original colours have unfortunately faded, but they were again red, green, black and white. These two portraits below were painted in celebration of that wedding before Penelope and Josiah returned to Plymouth Colony. They were painted to mark the occasion, and as you see, they're twin portraits of the same size with the couple turned towards each other. Again, we see the role which visible representations of marriage played within a household. In 1680, Josiah died at the age of 52, and Penelope commissioned this mourning ring, which you see at the top, in memory of Josiah. This was made by a goldsmith called John Coney of Boston. It's a very early piece of jewellery from America. It's gold with a typical floral design on the outside. Inside the ring, which contains a hollowed space, are a few grey strands of Josiah's hair, which are visible on this photo, but only when the ring has broken down, and it's unclear as to whether that was actually visible in 1680. Without knowledge of Penelope and Josiah, this is another mourning ring which can be analysed according to material function and design. But with no provenance, I can place it within a timeline of other objects, particularly as this ring somewhat unusually does not have an inscription. The final object which survives from this particular story is another portrait. So Josiah's parents were Edward and Susanna Winslow, and they came to the New World on board the Mayflower. At that stage they were both married to other people, but their spouses had both died within a year. They then married each other in 1621, which was the first marriage in Plymouth Colony, and in the next 20 years they had several children together. Edward ultimately left Plymouth Colony to join the Civil War in England in 1646, and after the execution of Charles I, he was sent to the West Indies by Lord Cromwell, and there he died probably after contracting yellow fever. So this painting is of Edward Winslow, and it was painted in the same year, 1651, and probably by the same unknown artist, as the paintings of his son and daughter-in-law in London when they got married. Susanna had not travelled with her son and soon-to-be daughter-in-law, but that doesn't mean she is absent from this painting. The only legible part of the letter, which Edward holds in his left hand, is at the bottom, and it reads, "From your loving wife, Susanna." So this painting is a clear example of text, image and object coming together to voice an emotion. Edward is visually reminding the viewer that despite a long absence, he is still committed to his marriage and that he is thinking of Susanna. One could speculate further to say that he misses her company and that he enjoys reading her letters. However, Without the accompanying knowledge of who Edward was and the long absence from Susanna, I would be able to place the objects from this particular family together. This is not critical to understanding what they were intended to do or represent, but it helps to create a fuller picture of the role which objects played within love and the life cycle. This part of the methodology also allows for analysis of those objects referenced in texts, but that no longer survive. For example, the well-known diplomat and widower Kenelm Digby describes how he left his wife instructions as to what to do. Describes how his wife left him with instructions as to what to do with one particular object. Quote, "In her will she had desired me to wear her wedding ring, the posy of which she bespoke herself, which was 2 hearts moulded, one within another, and written beside them, 'What earthly joy is like to this?'" End quote. While many facets of Kenelm's mourning have actually survived, this ring has not, but it can still be reached and consequently understood through text. This particular example also reveals the complex relationship between the original intentions of an object, in this case a marital one, and what happens when that object became one of mourning. Due to the passage of time, this unavoidably happens to the majority of objects concerned with love. The final phase of my methodology, and one which has already been alluded to in discussion of the other 4, is research through quantitative analysis. The digitisation of all source material, but in this instance of the object, allows me to identify trends across hundreds of objects, to ascertain colours, symbols and recurring words. For example, this slide demonstrates the voices which are represented within 450 surviving posy inscriptions. While much could be taken from this graph, and I don't have that much time, the love represented, as you can see, is predominantly I, my or our love, with only a small number clearly indicating gender. I believe this trend is a reflection of how marital love is viewed, a male and female gender coming together and creating one, and that one does not necessarily have a gender of its own. And this conclusion and further conclusions on the genderless nature of posy rings stems from the variety of sizes, indicating they're worn by both men and women, from textual sources, and from the typically genderless tones of inscriptions as demonstrated here. Collectively, inscriptions can also inform us of many qualities which were sought after when getting married and being in love. This is a representation of the words concerning how people associated love or where they rooted love, which appear again in 450 rings. So the size of the word demonstrates those qualities which appear with greater frequency, and love and loving have the largest frequency, nearly a quarter, followed by choice, which was just slightly less. Note the large scope of qualities and associations, bearing in mind also that I've grouped and therefore unavoidably narrowed the scope in order for it to be presentable. There are popular expressions and qualities, but the wording with which these were represented in rings was actually very diverse, despite people having published guides to help them pick posies. I believe this slide is an indication, if not a representation, of the qualities which betrothed and newly wedded couples were striving for, either to discover in coming years, or in order to preserve what they had already forged together. In conclusion, these 5 methods offer a way into the emotional qualities of the objects I've been looking at. I believe that individually, the objects and the methods are susceptible to criticisms. When we combine these methods together, the case is much stronger. For example, when the gold material of the ring was of great monetary and metaphorical value, when the shape signified the round and eternal quality of the bond, when the inscription inferred both choice and affection, when the purpose was to publicly inform others that the wearer was married, and when the intimate function lay in the inscription being against the skin, private one, when there is a ring of known provenance which cements what I've been discussing, and finally, when there are 500 other rings which infer similar meanings, the conclusions are much more persuasive. This example is just one type of object. I've shown you a few others in this paper, all of which can speak in the same way. The quantitative method allows us to identify trends, possible changes over time, and while survival remains a complex factor, the more pieces that we look at, the wider group of people we can begin to apply our conclusions to. Using materiality was a recognised means of pledging, confirming, preserving and grieving love through bending coins, embroidering hair, carving domestic utensils, giving beds in boxes, and in many other ways in the early modern period.